Check out more economic wit at swifteconomics.com.
Our 31st chief executive will come to FDR, of course, but first Herbert Clark Hoover. He's elected to succeed his fellow Republican Calvin Coolidge, takes office in March 1929. The Roaring Twenties are still roaring. But about 7 months later, October 1929, the stock market crashes and the Great Depression is on. Listen to two quotations, Amity. The first is from an article, Don't Blame Hoover, by Stanford historian David Kennedy. Quote, Hoover's struggle against the Depression was circumscribed by the institutional and intellectual limitations of the day. The federal government was a scanty, Jeffersonian structure with limited resources. Hoover would play no small part in its radical transformation. Close quote. The second, from Amity Shlaes in The Forgotten Man, quote, Hoover's priggish temperament, as much as any philosophy he held, caused him both to misjudge the crash and fail in his reaction to it. Now I ask you to adjudicate between yourself and David Kennedy. Who's right about Herbert Hoover?
We're both right. We're both right. Hoover was a constitutionalist. And you see later him fighting with the New Dealers. Harold Ickes, the father of the current political advisor, attacked Hoover for having unconstitutional laws. And Hoover really called him on that. This was later during the New Deal. He said, what I did was constitutional, and the court upheld it. And that was true. Hoover
as distinct from FDR, who pushes the envelope,
who could care
goes up
less.
to the Supreme Court and gets a number of, we'll come to that, but the Supreme Court throws a number of New Deal legislation out. Go ahead.
So there David is absolutely correct. Hoover lived in the world of the gold standard. He was a commodities person. Remember, Hoover was fabulously successful in the right field. Luck makes talent look like genius.
Anyone who works at the Hoover Institution continues to enjoy the success. He endowed that institution,
right.
Of course.
He was sort of the Bill Gates. Nowadays, engineering is hot again, but for a long time it wasn't. Back then it was very, very hot. He was the best paid young man of his generation. There was an article about that in the paper. When he was a young engineer, he was a mining engineer. So he believed in the gold standard because partly he was in the gold business. He got things out of the ground, minerals. And so that was one area where he was sort of contained. He couldn't imagine a world without the gold standard mechanism from which he had benefited when he lived in London, in the great world of trade prior to World War I and II. He was a constitutionalist. He didn't really imagine the federal government going in and rewriting everything.
It occurs to me that we know from our traffic that a lot of the people who watch these interviews are college students and some high school students. You'd better just explain the gold standard, it occurs to me.
Oh, well, if you had $1, you could go to the bank and get a piece of gold for it.
And therefore, the amount of currency in circulation always had a physical limit.
It had a...
You could not issue more dollars than could be supported by actual bars of gold,
It's a little bit more complicated than that because, of course, banks create money when they lend money, but it has to do with the trust. If you believe you will always get the gold, then there need be less gold in the safe.
Right.
If everyone is always confident, then the amount of gold relative to the amount of currency outstanding need be less.
Right.
But yes, basically you need to be able to get that gold.
So if the trust falters,
then there's
you get
runs
on the bank, and it is difficult, if not impossible, to liquidate the economy, to pump more currency into the economy because the amount of gold is obviously physically limited. Is that correct?
Yes.
It very much circumscribes the ability of the government to push currency out into the economy, right?
That's right.
Okay.
And the government is doesn't have the power that it has now to just inflate like that. That was regarded as a great good. So Hoover believed in the gold standard. He also believed in he didn't believe the federal government could just do stuff, and the Hoover Dam is a good example. He went and brokered among all these states that they would get along and work together, and I think there are 7 states involved in the Hoover Dam. Is that correct? And he very carefully and very constitutionally went about making that arrangement. He didn't impose it all from Washington. That's another example of something he thought that government couldn't do, that Kennedy would have called Jeffersonian.
Let me give you a couple of Hoover's responses to the Great Depression, and very briefly, you give me the correct way to think about them. Signed into law, June 17, 1930, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, which raises tariffs on some 220,000 imported goods to record levels. Smoot-Hawley, Herbert Hoover signs it. How do we think of that? What do we make of that?
Well, in those days, the Republicans were the tariff party. So Hoover was sort of like a politician today, a businessman who becomes a politician. Mike Bloomberg, Arnold Schwarzenegger, someone from another field who comes into politics because of his tremendous success. So he was ambivalent about even which party to be in. He fit better in the Republicans. He became a Republican. He was elected as a Republican. He had to go along with their platform. It was right there, one of the planks, protectionism, 1928, Republicans. So it wasn't that he invented this tariff, which was a significant tariff, the second post-war tariff, but he went along with it. And where I chide him in The Forgotten Man is I say, well, actually, Herbert knew better. Hoover was an international man. He made the first part of his career in Australia, then he went to China, Boxer Rebellion, then he went to London, he went to Russia. He saw how bad the czars were, and he knew that trade was really important. Trade and free trade made him rich and prosperous, made him able to take his wife Lou around London, and
So
yet
the argument against Smoot-Hawley is
he signed a protectionist tariff that
it hurts Americans. Why?
Hurts Americans because other countries retaliate, which they did.
So it shuts down trade.
Shuts down trade.
And
hurts
Herbert
the
Hoover
economy,
knew better.
and he knew better, and he
Right.
signed this tariff. And when you go back and look at who protested, more than 1,000 economists signed a document begging Hoover not to sign. Smoot-Hawley, one of them, was from Stanford, his own school. And they said, please don't sign this. Lamont, one of the Wall Street figures, said, went down on my knees and almost begged Hoover not to sign that asinine tariff. So Hoover knew better,
He
and
and his
that's why I'm
buddies
a
all
little
knew
bit
better.
hard on him. But it
The
was
Revenue Act of
the party.
1932.
This was a tax increase. Well, I think he knew better there too. But again, you want to say, why did he do it? There's a reason. He believed in the gold standard. The government really can't run a deficit in the gold standard because then there's a run, as you described before. So he was being prudent in the terms in which he lived. And the gold standard universe was another universe. We can't just go back and say it's bad to to raise taxes in a downturn. That's Keynesian talk, what we're talking, or supply side / Keynesian talk. In those days, it really did. You did have to balance the budget because otherwise you'd have a run on your currency.